All right, so have you ever wondered what it actually takes to restore your gun rights?
It's a question we get a lot.
Yeah, and let me tell you,
Yeah.
it's way more complicated than most people realize.
Oh, yeah.
So today, we're diving deep into a case that Adam Kraut over at the Legal Brief podcast covered.
Oh, I like that show.
Yeah, it's really good. And his
Yeah.
episode, Get Your 2A Rights Back,
Yeah.
is a real eye-opener because it demonstrates
Yeah.
how you can lose your gun rights
Yeah.
even if you've never been convicted of a felony.
Right. And the case that he talks about really highlights how a common misunderstanding about gun rights can have a huge impact on someone's life.
It really can. The case is about a Pennsylvania man named Raymond Holloway. Back in 2005, he got a second DUI, which in Pennsylvania is classified as a misdemeanor.
But here's where it gets interesting,
Good.
because that particular misdemeanor carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years. It triggered the federal firearms ban.
So even though it wasn't a felony in his state,
Uh-huh.
the potential sentence length
Yeah.
meant that he fell under federal law.
Exactly.
Oh,
It's a
Holloway.
classic example of how federal law doesn't always align with state law.
Right.
And years later, Holloway actually decided to challenge this ban, arguing it was unconstitutional in his specific case.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really legally complex.
Okay, so break it down for us.
Sure.
What were the major arguments at play here?
So the court relied on a precedent
Okay.
set by a case called Binder Up, which basically established a two-step process
Okay.
to determine if someone should be banned from owning a gun.
Okay. I'm listening. Lay it on me.
Okay, so the first step
Yeah.
is figuring out if the person's crime falls into a category of offenses historically viewed as serious enough to warrant losing gun rights. The podcast actually used the term unvirtuous citizen.
Oh, interesting.
Basically, is someone who committed a crime that was considered serious enough to lose their gun rights.
Okay, that makes sense. So if the crime fixed that unvirtuous citizen definition, is that pretty much it?
Yeah, essentially.
Like no more guns?
Yeah, you're done.
Okay.
But if the crime doesn't neatly fit into those historical categories, then step 2 kicks in.
Right.
And then the government has to show that taking away this specific person's guns is really needed to prevent what they call armed mayhem.
Okay, got it. So how did this two-step test apply in Holloway's case?
Right.
I mean, it was a second DUI, even with that potential for longer sentence.
Yeah.
Considered serious enough
Yeah.
to automatically strip him of his Second Amendment rights.
Right. That was the big question. So the court looked at a bunch of factors.
Okay.
One of those factors was, is it a felony or a misdemeanor? Even though it carried a potential 5-year sentence, Holloway's DUI was still legally a misdemeanor.
So that's a point in his favor.
Yeah, definitely. They also considered whether the crime involved violence, and obviously a DUI does not.
Right. No violence.
So another point for Holloway.
Okay, so far so good for Holloway.
Yeah.
What else did they look at?
Well, the third factor was the actual sentence he received.
Okay.
And this one was a little more complicated.
Okay.
While his sentence was tougher than what other folks got in similar binder up cases, it was still way shorter than the maximum possible sentence.
Gotcha. So kind of a mixed bag on that one.
Right, exactly.
Okay, what about that last factor?
So the last factor was what's called cross-jurisdictional consensus.
Okay.
Basically, they wanted to see if all 50 states were on the same page about DUIs.
Well, they really did their homework.
Yeah, they were thorough.
Okay.
And what they found was pretty interesting. It turns out there's a huge variation in how different states punish DUIs. So there's no clear consensus on just how serious a second DUI should actually be.
So not a clear-cut case.
Right, lots of nuance.
So what did the court finally decide?
Okay.
Like, did they say that just because Holloway had a DUI, that he automatically lost his gun rights?
No. After reviewing everything, the court decided that Holloway's crime on its own wasn't serious enough to automatically take away his Second Amendment rights under that first step of the binder-up test.
Okay.
So they moved on to step 2.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, so that's where things got really interesting.
Okay, so they moved on to step 2.
Right.
So that's where things got really interesting.
It did.
Yeah.
So since they couldn't just take away his rights based on the crime itself, the government had to try and prove that disarming Holloway was absolutely necessary to prevent, well, you know, that armed mayhem we talked about.
So I'm guessing that didn't exactly go as planned.
Not really. They brought in an expert who tried to argue that basically disarming people like Holloway was really important for keeping the public safe.
Okay.
Their expert's report claimed that people who struggle with alcohol or have a history of violence are more likely to use guns to arm themselves or others.
Yeah, that does sound like a legitimate concern.
Right.
So where did their argument fall apart?
Well, their argument was way too broad. They didn't actually show any evidence that Holloway himself posed a specific risk, especially considering he'd had a clean record for over a decade since the DUI.
Oh, wow. So they really needed to focus on Holloway?
Yeah, they did.
And not just general DUI statistics?
Right. The court actually called them out on that, saying, and I quote, "Individuals like Holloway, after over a decade of virtuous, non-criminal behavior, remain so potentially irresponsible that they should be prohibited from owning a firearm."
Wow.
Yeah, right.
They did not hold back.
Nope.
So what was the court's final decision?
In the end, the court ruled in Holloway's favor and permanently blocked the government from enforcing the gun ban against him.
So big win for Holloway.
Huge.
I'm sure this case has a lot of folks thinking,
yeah,
okay, so anyone with a DUI can just go get their gun rights back now.
Well, not so fast. It's important to keep in mind that this ruling only applies to Holloway's specific situation.
Right.
This wasn't like a blanket decision covering all DUI.
So it's not a free pass for everybody.
Right. But it does show that courts are starting to recognize that not all DUIs are created equal when it comes to the Second Amendment.
Okay, that makes sense. So even though someone has a DUI on their record, that doesn't mean they automatically lose their gun rights forever.
Exactly.
That's huge. I mean, this case also proves that it is possible to challenge the federal firearms ban.
Yeah, it's possible.
It might be an uphill battle.
Oh, for sure.
But Holloway's case shows that it can be done.
Exactly. And especially since the ATF is no longer doing those individual reviews.
Well, this case definitely raises a lot of interesting points.
It does.
What would you say is the most important takeaway you want our listeners to understand?
I think what's really crucial to remember here is that this case shows how important it is to consider individual circumstances and evidence. Yep. The court didn't just rely on these generalizations about DUIs or, just try to scare people. They demanded real proof that Holloway actually posed a threat, and the government just couldn't do that.
Wow. So basically this case shows that even in something as politically charged as gun rights, the courts are really insisting on facts over fear.
Exactly. That's a really significant point.
It really is. So for anyone listening who might be in a similar situation as Holloway, they've lost their gun rights because of a misdemeanor and they want to get them back.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them?
So the first thing to understand is that there are no guarantees.
Right.
As we discussed, this ruling doesn't apply to every misdemeanor case.
Yeah, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope. But it does demonstrate that it's possible to challenge the federal firearms ban. It highlights that courts are willing to look at the specific facts of a case instead of just applying a blanket rule.
Okay, so it's not totally hopeless.
No, not at all.
There's a potential path forward.
Yeah.
Even though it might be a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, it can be tough. And that path often involves showing that you have a consistent history of good behavior, good character, and solid evidence that proves you're not a threat.
So it sounds like a lot of work, but for someone who's really committed to getting their rights back,
definitely,
it might be worth it.
Absolutely. And it also underlines how important it is to get legal advice from someone who specializes in firearms law.
Right, because a good lawyer can look at each case individually.
Yeah.
He can help figure out the best way to move forward.
That's right. And remember, the law is really complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
And cases like this are super nuanced, so having an expert can make a huge difference.
That makes sense. So for anyone out there who's in this situation, who's lost their gun rights and is feeling kind of stuck, don't give up.
Right.
Talk to a lawyer. See what your options are.
Yeah.
And remember that there are legal ways to fight for your rights.
Exactly. And it's also really important to remember that Holloway's case is just one small part of this much bigger conversation about gun rights, public safety, and finding that balance between individual freedom and collective security.
And that conversation is definitely not going away anytime soon.
No, it's not.
And cases like Holloway's keep bringing it back to the forefront.
Absolutely.
It really does feel like we've only just like scratched the surface here.
Yeah, there's always so much more to uncover, especially with something this complex. You know, one thing that I keep thinking about is how the court actually went to the trouble of looking at DUI laws in all 50 states.
Right.
It kind of shows how our legal system is a bit of a patchwork, doesn't it?
It does. And it really makes things more complicated when you think about how what might be considered a serious crime in one state could be handled completely differently somewhere else.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder how fair and consistent these federal gun restrictions actually are.
You've hit on a really important point there.
Yeah.
Like, it really makes you question if everyone's actually getting a fair shake under the law, no matter where they happen to live.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, you know, if Holloway had been living in a state with stricter DUI laws, this whole case could have gone a completely different way.
Absolutely. The fact that where you live can have such a huge impact on something as fundamental as your gun rights is pretty mind-blowing when you really think about it.
Yeah. It's almost like a lottery system where your rights depend on your zip code.
Exactly. And this lack of consistency just makes the argument for, you know, legal challenges and advocacy even stronger. We've really got to make sure that these rights are being protected consistently across the board.
So, taking a step back from, you know, the details of this specific case, what kind of bigger questions does this raise about the Second Amendment and gun rights in America today?
You know, for me, this case just brings that constant tension between individual rights and public safety into really sharp focus. Like, how do we effectively balance those two? It's a question that we're always wrestling with. And honestly, there are good points to be made on both sides.
And it's definitely a debate that isn't going away. And cases like Holloway's just keep it front and center.
Absolutely. It forces us to face those really basic questions about the Second Amendment head on.
It does.
Like, what limits on gun ownership are actually okay? How do we make sure those limits are fair and that they don't infringe on the rights of law-abiding citizens? Those are really tough questions. There aren't any easy answers.
Yeah, for sure. And as we've seen in this deep dive, the answers can be totally different depending on the situation, the legal precedents, and even like the specific court where the case is being heard.
It reminds us that the law isn't always so black and white, you know? There's a lot of gray area. And how the law is actually interpreted can make a world of difference.
Which just means that it's more important than ever to stay informed, to be critical thinkers, and to keep looking at these issues from all sides.
Couldn't agree more. The more we actually understand about these legal ins and outs, the better prepared we'll be to deal with these kinds of situations and to advocate for policies that protect individual rights, but also consider public safety.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dives today, what's the one thing you really want our listener to take away and think about as they learn more about this topic?
You know, I would really encourage them to think about the bigger picture implications of this whole case. You know, beyond the specifics of DUIs and gun rights, it raises some fundamental questions about, you know, justice, fairness, and that balance of power in our society. How can we make sure the law is actually serving its purpose while also protecting the rights of individuals? That's definitely something worth thinking about, even long after this deep dive is over.
That's a really great point to end on.
Yeah.
It reminds us that fighting for justice is a never-ending thing. And we all have a role to play by staying involved and thinking critically.
Absolutely. By having these conversations and really trying to understand different perspectives, we can all help create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation, and we hope you'll keep exploring these important issues with us.
Me too.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep searching for the truth.
Absolutely.
And remember, knowledge is power.
It is.
Especially when it comes to understanding our complicated world.
Well said.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.
See ya!